like that about the actual battlefield. But a lot of folks don't realize that was one of the bloodiest battles in the American Revolution. We lost about, I think it was 600 killed and wounded that day, if I remember correctly, and the British lost about 500 killed and wounded. They also had 200 men run from the field that day. Marion's job that day was, he led the largest force he'd ever led that day there at Battle of Utah Springs. He had the whole right flank of Nathaniel Greene's army, 700 militiamen from South Carolina and North Carolina. They took the fight to the British that day, so much so that the British had to turn to look at him, and at the same time Pickens was hitting him on his right flank at that time. They overran him for a moment there at Battle of Utah Springs. Looked like the Patriots were going to win, but again, the battle was in September. It was one of the hottest summers they had had. The guys had not had any good supplies that whole spring or summer. So, of course, they see all these wagon loads full of stuff that the British had, and they start getting into the rum. They start grabbing stuff, and it becomes a melee out there for who can get the most stuff quickest, because, I mean, they thought the battle was won. But it turned out that Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Stewart had this really talented officer by the name of Major Banks, and he was able to turn the tide of the battle and forced the commander to go ahead and move his forces back. The British were going to try to hold it, but their supply had really been ravished by the Patriots that day, so they ended up having to go back to Charleston. Greene sent his forces down there. They encapsulated Charleston, and pretty much that was the end of the big fights here in South Carolina. The militiamen just stayed right there around Charleston for the most part until the last of the British invaders left. Of course, the Treaty of Paris was signed not too long after the victory there at Yorktown. By that time, Cornwallis's troops had already been out of Charleston for several months. And one good key quote that I always like to show about the sacrifice and the valor of the soldiers here in South Carolina is this one. It's that South Carolina's citizen soldiers had suffered more, dared more, and achieved more than the men of any other state. And that comes from noted historian George Bancroft, who wrote his 1857 History of the United States book. A lot of folks don't know, too, that a third of the battles fought in the American Revolution were fought right here in South Carolina. Most of those battles fought by your citizen soldiers. Ooh, it's going the wrong way there. I haven't got this clicker thing down yet, so you're going to have to give me instructions. Of course, one of my favorite paintings, anytime I have a commander that retires, one thing that I try to do, if it's like a 06 or above, is I try to give them a copy of this Farewell to the Generals, because this really says it all. Like I said, here in South Carolina, we adore Francis Marion. A lot of our units are named after him. And of course, there's Francis Marion right there in the far left of this picture, and that was painted of Washington's Farewell to the Generals. One thing I want to do in ending here is invite you, if you haven't been to the South Carolina Military Museum up in Columbia, South Carolina, to come by and visit. Bob's been there. Bob, what do you think of it?
It's amazing what y'all have done and what the potential is. It's really worth doing.
Well, thank you. Thank you. You'll notice Bob's in the picture there. He's the one. I told him he was going to be in the presentation today. He said, "No way." I said, "Yeah." But the reason I put this picture in there, we have DAR groups coming there all the time, and we really enjoy bringing those ladies in. And anybody that wants to come, we highly encourage you to come. One thing that you'll see there that's one of our prized possessions is the gorget that was issued to one of two people. We know it belonged to either Francis Marion or William Moultrie. Governor Rutledge, after the war, had a Charleston goldsmith craft 2 gold Gorgats for those 2 generals. And we've got one of them there in the museum. That's what all those good folks right there are standing around is one of those great generals' Gorgats. But thank you very much for your patience. And do I have any questions?
Yeah, when's the museum open? What are the hours?
Yes, sir. The only day we're not open is Mondays.
The way I interpret the format.
His most recent retirement is from taking tours to Europe and England. And he's come out of retirement, I don't know how many times to take another tour. And so we'll see if one more presentation in left in him for this. He's an old man.
Oh, you're brave, George.
When I said he was an old man, I was talking about the character that young Dr. Stukes is portraying. It's about 20 years past the American Revolution, and we're all walking down Broad Street in Charleston, and if we're fortunate, we may see the governor sitting on his front porch, and sometimes he'll even converse with us and sort of reminisce a little bit.
Goodbye, old boy, little young fella. Goodbye. I apologize to you all for that I'm not in the formal dress to welcome you, but you are welcome here in my house. I love to sit here on the front porch. That's Broad Street there, you know. This was my house when I was a boy. If my grandfather was the first one to come to this country, and of course we belong to Great Britain. Great Britain. He and his brother both came, my grandfather. And by the time I came along, my father and mother had 8 children in the 10 years they were married. And there were seven of us who were still alive. I was the oldest. There were 5 of us boys. And my youngest brother, Edward, perhaps you know Edward. Edward? You know Edward? You know, I've been sick, and it's hard for me to remember. You must remember Edward. Edward's the governor of South Carolina in this year. This is the year 1800, isn't it? Isn't it 1800? 1800. Oh, Edward died. He died about 6 months ago. He was the youngest of the boys. You know, I just forget so much. But it wasn't always this way. When I was younger, I never forgot anything. I was noted both for my good eyesight, which has now left me, but also for my memory. My mother, when she was 25 years old, she had 7 children, and her husband died, but left her 3 plantations and this building site here in Charleston, not this house, but this building site. And she decided that I should go to be a lawyer, and so I went. I studied at the Inns of the Court in England. I went over there when I was 14 years old, and I stayed in England about 4 years, almost 5. And I did my coursework, and I was accepted into the bar in England. I will say that in addition to my coursework, though I enjoyed myself in England, I've always been partial to the English people. I not only had a good time in the city of London where we had our entertainments from time to time, but I loved the theater. I went to the theater often, and my favorite actor was one you've probably heard of, David Garrick. Mr. Garrick was a thespian of the top order, and he was bringing back, in those days, the plays of a playwright who had been dead 150 years. His name was Shakespeare, the British pronounce it. But David Garrick was putting on Shakespeare plays. I loved watching them. And I came back to America, and I have been to the theater in every opportunity. We have a wonderful theater here in Charleston, and if you have not seen it, it's revived. It'll be back again. The Dock Street Theater here. We put on good plays. I haven't been able to act in any of them, for I was never an actor. But I did love the stage and the theater productions. I came back to America and within a year had been accepted to the bar. And from the very start, because of the good education I had and because of the good connections that I had, I was a success as a lawyer from the very beginning. We had lots of money to begin with, but money poured into us. I was able, with the money, to help my mother, who was a widow. And when I got married myself, my wife and I have had 10 children. Two have died. But I've been able to educate all my children. And I was always able, also in addition to being a lawyer here in Charleston, I was able to take part in community affairs. It's a matter of virtue, as was done in the Middle Ages in Florence and other places. Men were expected to take part in the government of cities and in all of the civic activities. I would not have anything to do with the Royal Council, for the Royal Council was appointed by the king. Indeed, I was elected by the people, because here we are in Charleston. We're not to be ruled by England. We rule ourselves. We have our rights as Englishmen, and Englishmen have the rights. Ever since 1215, they had run me when the Magna Carta was signed. British advantages are that men rule themselves. And so I was elected to the Provincial Congress. Provincial Congress, not the Royal Council. I came from the people. I did not come from the king. My friend, too, whose brother lives right across the street, in that house right over there, across the street. He was James Lawrence, and his younger brother, Henry. Henry Lawrence and I were good friends. We were elected together, we served together. We spent many hours together, and our families have united, too. My daughter, Elizabeth, is married to Henry's son, Hank. We've had good connections, good connections. The Provincial Congress had troubles. We had troubles with the king's representatives. The tax collectors were arrogant. The tax collectors would make up their own rules sometimes. They would not observe the laws of civilization, even the way they would sometimes go aboard the ships and investigate the cargo of the ships and tax the ships indiscriminately sometimes. The only way we could strike back was that the Provincial Congress here in Charleston was the one that commanded the city purse, the county purse, the whole of the province's purse. We paid the salaries of the governors, even though those governors had been appointed by the king. Governor Boone, in particular, was objectionable to us all. I liked Governor Boone as an educated man. That was about the only thing I liked of him. He was not only educated, but he was arrogant. He was dictatorial. And his loyalty was not to the people that he was appointed to govern. His loyalty was the king. And our only way to control him, only way to influence him, was to withhold his pay. And we did. We did. And I remember, too, one other objection that I had. When young John Wilkes, over there in England, printer of a newspaper, fighting for independence and liberty, as far as the journalist world was concerned, independent of any rule of the king, just to print the truth. And when the king moved against him and put him in jail, we in Carolina, we ourselves here in South Carolina, we sent money to the John Wilkes Defense Fund to help him pay his lawyers in England to fight for freedom of the press. It irritated the king. It angered the governor. But it was a stroke for liberty and freedom. Not freedom from the king, but freedom to be Englishmen. And that led me to another problem in my life. Because one of my friends was Christopher Gadsden. Now, Christopher Gadsden, he didn't live on Broad Street, he lived back a ways. But Mr. Gadsden, he was really a radical. And he told us as early as 1770, you know, I wasn't but 30 years old in 1770, and Christopher Gadsden would come along and say, we need to get rid of the king. We need to be independent. Well, now that seemed to be a little drastic. It seems to me that really what we ought to demand is not to be independent. I love the idea of belonging within the British Empire. It was the greatest empire in the world. It had the biggest army, it had the biggest navy, but more than that, it had a colorful literary background, and it had its emphasis on the theater. The culture and the art of the British outshone all of those arts of the Italians of the past and of the Spanish of the present. It was an honor to be an Englishman, but to be treated by the king and by the Parliament as though we were nothing but illiterate, ignorant, and hard to control colonists. I did believe we ought to have our rights as Englishmen. We ought to have our rights, but we ought to have our rights as Englishmen. We were not servants of the king. We were his subjects, the ones that he's proud of, the one who has made his empire the greatest empire in the world. Henry Lawrence, my friend, we believe the same thing. And we had a little trouble trying to control people like Christopher Gadsden and those Drake boys. They were wild. They were wild in their attitudes. The idea of standing up and spitting in the face of the English monarch, oh, it was hard to understand. Hard to understand. One of our first great showdown fights was over the Stamp Act. You remember that the British, in order to pay for their army, which they had stationed up in Boston and another part of these colonies we were in those days, states now, but we were colonies then. And the British said we had to pay for the army. Well, we didn't want the army over here. The British said to us that the army had saved us from the Indians when we were having the war, which lasted for 7 years, the so-called French and Indian War. The British Army didn't win that war, the Americans won that war. We didn't need the British Army to protect us, we could protect ourselves. But he foisted the army on us, and then said we had to pay for it. And one of the ways to pay for it was a stamp tax. They put taxes in the form of stamps on all the legal documents. And so all of us who were lawyers, we had to deal with the stamps at all times. We protested about it. There was a Stamp Act Congress called in 1770. I went. I was one of the delegates that was sent from South Carolina. And we protested. And I was in favor of the protest. There were a few people. There were a few people that went to that Congress who already in 1770 were ready for independence. To get rid of the British Empire, throw the British Empire away, try to stand on our own 2 feet on the same ground that the British stood upon. And I thought it was preposterous. I thought it was a losing fight. And I tried to persuade them that what we wanted was our rights as Englishmen, not as our rights as an independent country, but our rights as Englishmen. I also approved of a document that we sent to the King and to the Parliament where we protested their rights, that they lived in England and they were making rules for South Carolina and the other colonies. It seemed proper that Englishmen who lived in England might very well make rules for Englishmen who lived in England. But Americans who were also Englishmen who lived in America, they make their own rules for the Americans who live in America and who are also Englishmen. We also agreed on a non-importation and a non-exportation agreement. And that meant that we would restrict trade. We would have a sort of an economic weapon of boycotting some of the English goods. I voted for that. I helped to moderate some of the language. It hurt some of our people. It hurt our people. For instance, rice, which was big business with us, all the rice farmers were hurt. And indigo, by which we got benefits from the British in the form of supplementary payments. We had to sacrifice. It was better to sacrifice with our money than to sacrifice with our lives on a battlefield. And if we can make our point with an economic weapon, it is better to do that than to do it with an attempted military weapon. And so I came back from the Stamp Act. Congress, we called it, the Stamp Act Congress. I was pleased with things. And I was also pleased when the British, before the Stamp Act Congress issue got out of hand, repealed the Stamp Act. We had won. We had won. Or so we thought. But then, of course, Parliament again enacted other duties. Our duty on tea, on one instance. I was one of those who helped avert a crisis in Charleston. In Boston and in Wilmington and near Philadelphia, the crisis got out of hand. And what became the most famous was because of that newspaper we had up there in Boston, that Sam Adams. Now, there's a rabble rouser for you. His name is Adams, not John Adams. He's a different man. Sam Adams. And Sam talked about the Boston Tea Party, where Bostonians threw the tea overboard, just destroyed private property, sank it in the harbor of Boston. And when the tea landed here in Charleston, there were some in Charleston who wanted to do the same thing. But we moved ahead of them. And we took the tea, and I'm sure you've heard about it. We stored it in the exchange building. We didn't try to sell it. We certainly didn't pay any taxes on it. And some of my friends were as joyed as I was when, finally, when war came, and we needed enough monies to buy war equipment, we sold the tea. And with that tea, we bought equipment to help our troops. Oh, the Townsend duties came. The British they just taxed us over and over again. In 1774, it got to a terrible situation following that Tea Party. The British cracked down upon the Americans in Boston. And what they call the Boston Port Bill, we call it the Intolerable Acts, because we're intolerable. There was terrible punishment to Boston. I was one of those who helped organize the first relief movements. When they closed the port of Boston, the Bostonians were faced with starvation. So we sent them help as best we could. I helped do that. I was still in the provincial Congress when, in the year of 1776, in the early part of that year, it came to our attention that the king had pronounced that we in the colonies were rebels. And that meant that we were rebelling against him, rebelling against England, rebelling against the whole of the British Empire. And so in sort of reaction to that, we decided that since he called us rebels, that he was not having us in the empire anymore. And so when a Continental Congress met and suggested that we might go ahead and establish our own governments, since the English king seemed to have abandoned us and was declaring war on us, and so in South Carolina, we made our own rules, we made our own government. we wrote a constitution in 1776, you remember? And we established ourselves as a Republic of South Carolina. And they elected me as the president of South Carolina. And my friend Henry Lawrence was the vice president. And remember, even in those days, we didn't want to fight Britain. I was still not in favor of independence. I was in favor of my rights as an Englishman. And the British wouldn't have it. We were having as much problem with some of those radicals like Christopher Gaston and those other boys that I told you about. They were so adamant. They created the Sons of Liberty, and there were mobs and riots. And Gaston would speak beneath the Liberty Tree in the most violent language, advocating the most violent activity. And it was difficult to hold the line with our fellows here in America. And at the same time, we had to struggle against the politicians in England. And then in 1776, when I was the president of South Carolina, the British tried to capture Charleston. You know, here's Broad Street. It's right out there, over in that direction is Sullivan's Island. You probably know where Sullivan's Island is. And there was a half-finished fort out there. And that half-finished fort endeavored to stop the British fleet from coming in to take Charleston from the sea. And you remember that battle we had in 1776. It's June the 28th. I'll never forget that day. And to my surprise, and to the surprise of a lot of us, our fort, with its artillery, with limited munitions, and with limited experience as artillerists, we chased the British back. British helped us with some stupid activity, but we chased the British back. I was so pleased about it. I heard about it, that brave Sergeant Jasper. I sent him a sword as a reward for the fact that he climbed over the wall and found the fallen flag and then scrambled back across over the sort of half breastworks that we had erected. And he and Colonel Moser himself fastened the flag once more and raised it above the fort. I sent the men, not swords, but kegs of rum, more appreciated. Well, you remember in 1778 we wrote another constitution and we established ourselves as a state. I was the governor of the state. 1778, 1780, Charleston had to surrender. I was in Charleston. I never had liked the first commander that the Continental Congress had sent down to us. He was an arrogant man. His name was Lee. He'd once been in the British Army. And he thought that he knew everything and the rest of us knew nothing. And so we clashed over and over again, and I was delighted when he was finally replaced by a man named Howe. But then General Lincoln was sent down. And General Lincoln brought with him a Continental Army. Some of us South Carolinians, some of our people got involved in the Continental Army. But most of us were just South Carolinians. There was a South Carolina militia. Hardly trained soldiers, but dedicated ones. Enough with their dedication to outmatch some of the training that the British had, and with some of those people whom the British hired to fight for them. I was one of those who said to General Lincoln, "You may not surrender Charleston." The British were coming, not by sea. We had taught them a lesson. They were coming by land. And it was a great movement with the British on the way. Shall we go out and fight the British, or shall we perhaps, because they might surround us and there was no place for us to retreat, if they cut off all the land access to Charleston, we would have our backs to the water, the ocean. But those of us in Charleston just didn't want to have the city surrendered to the British. And so we sort of demanded of General Lincoln that he stay and fight. And so he stayed. It was against his better judgment. As it turned out to be a classic mistake, the British did cut off access by land and moved closer and closer, and it looked as though there was no possible way except for us to surrender the city. And I was prepared to be surrendered along with others in the city. And General Lincoln himself came to me, and he said to me that it just would not do for me as the governor of the state of South Carolina to be captured. And he arranged for me with a few others, including my brother Edward, to slip out of Charleston. There were just 5 of us, and we sneaked out, made our way up to the Newt's Ferry and crossed over the river and made our way into some safety. Alas, that was 1780. And then until 1782, it wasn't so much safety as it was flight. I spent as much time in hiding as I spent in being the governor of the state. As a matter of fact, I spent more time in North Carolina than in South Carolina. And one of my friends said to me one time that he knew where the seat of government of South Carolina was during those years. And where the seat of government was in my saddle on my horse as I fled from one place to the other. We not only lost Charleston, but that same year we had a terrible slaughter at the Waxhaws, Tarleton's Quarter. And then of course we lost Camden and the whole of the Santee. The British had built forts right along the way from Camden through Fort Granby and Fort Mott and Fort White. They built forts from Camden to Charleston and cut our new state, as we call it. No longer a colony, state. Just sliced it up. And I did what I could, which was not much. I was in flight and I was in fear of being captured. I moved my family out of the state into some safety. But I wasn't the only one who was in danger. Among those who were in danger was, bless their hearts, the Christian preachers, because the preachers had taken the lead in the revolution. One of those whom I heard, even though I was Anglican by faith, he was a Baptist, and his name was Richard Furman, and he was a fervent speaker. And the British even put a price on his head by name, 50 pounds, reward. Richard Furman, like me, spent much of the time in North Carolina. We never quit. We had just been displaced, though we were severely criticized. I don't know what people wanted me to do. I wasn't a soldier, and I didn't know how to manipulate others. I did not know how to strategize, and I was no military tactician. I would have probably been more harm than good if I was in charge of the military. And I will say to you in all seriousness, I did the best I could. And then the Continental sat down after that battle at Camden and had a hope for defeat. And the general that had been there, General Gates, was no longer there. And he's replaced by a man named Greene, Nathaniel Greene. Nathaniel Greene hadn't seen much of the battlefield experience either. As a matter of fact, he'd grown up a Quaker, a pacifist. And here he was, general. And he'd been a quartermaster general. That means he can compile supplies. He can develop strategy and follow tactics. But they assured us that he was a good man. As a matter of fact, I came to believe that he was a good man. One of the problems that I faced was that this man, General Greene, he was a Continental officer. He had been sent to the southern part of this new country of ours by the Congress. And so he reported to the Continental Congress. He was in in the same sort of relationship as George Washington. And George Washington was a Virginian. Nathaniel Greene was a Rhode Islander, and we were in South Carolina. And I was the governor of South Carolina. And the people that we had in South Carolina who fought were people like Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter and Andrew Pickens and many, many others. But they weren't in the Continental Army as much as they were militiamen and just fighters who were fighting for liberty, who were trying to live out their lives with their families and trying to scratch out a living with their agriculture and their trade and their commerce. But somehow I got caught in between General Greene and his Continental troops and these people who were fighting with Sumter and Marion and Pickens and all those others. And I was responsible to them. And when they quarreled with each other, General Greene looked to me to be the pacifier. But I will tell you, when you get a man like Thomas Sumter, who gets his dander up and decides he wants to fight, and he wants to carry vengeance in his own way, he doesn't like to be compromised with. And I would write him letters, and sometimes he would write back and sometimes not. And I would write Francis Marion, who would occasionally write back, usually with a lot of misspelling along the way. He didn't go to the ends of court. And sometimes General Marion would refuse to answer. Sometimes he would just write me back and engage in argument with me. And sometimes when I told him I wish he would do one thing, he would do something else. I really had no control and no way to discipline these men. And I would try to say that to General Rutledge. He was a patient man. He's a Quaker. He's a patient man. And I think he understood part of my problems. But I will say to you, I was disappointed in my performance because my title said I was the governor of the state. My position was that I was in charge of things. And the reality was something else. And try as I couldn't solve it. And it grew to a point when the quarrels between General Sumter and General Marion were so severe that General Greene said to me, you have got to do something to make sure that one man is in charge and another man is not in charge, and we have a unified movement among the South Carolina troops. And every time I tried to tell Francis Marion something, he would reply to me that he was a Continental officer. He had Continental rank. Well, I give him a state rank too. He's got 2 ranks. And because Sumter was there first, and because of various other reasons, I finally decided that I had to say to General Marion that he had to obey the orders of General Sumter. And that just about ended my whatever influence I had with General Marion. It seems as though we in South Carolina, we partisans, enjoyed struggling with each other more than we decided it was our duty to struggle against the Tories and struggle against the British. I will say, on their part, they had their own problems too. General Marion in particular. He had terrific arguments between his lieutenants. Peter O'Ree, who had been a personal friend and supporter, and Hezekiah Mahan, who was a much better educated man and a talent for fighting and for strategizing. And the problems that I had between trying to keep the Sumter ball and the Marion ball in the air at the same time. Francis Marion had the same sort of problems, trying to keep the O'Ree ball and the Mahan ball. And then, of course, Francis Marion elected to the Senate. He's a legislator as well as a fighter. I will say to General Greene, he kept his army in the field. No smashing victories, but no colossal losses. And even after